get, and the more that something impacts your life, the more that you likely get. And you can choose what private services to spend it on. Also note that we advocate to do things like combine this with, government support to set up private services at the point where they don't exist, so we can support the subsidisation then in the short term, and we can also assume there'd be regulation like things like the FWC would obviously exist for them. Second of all, there's note the government services that would still exist would be things like wheelchair allocation, it would be things like having public allocation to educational resources, clarification. Yep, go for it.
What's the difference between what happens now and you setting up and funding private services?
So, what we're saying is that at the point where private services don't exist in the status quo because there's no market incentive, we will give the market incentive for them to be a thing, but like we can provide some form of government subsidization at the start, and then they will become fully private and monthly owned, and it's a totally fair piece of privatisation. Firstly, why are private services better? Firstly, what is the problem with the public services under the status quo? As I alluded to in my introduction, the NDIS is incredibly shit. It's run by government employees who often don't care that much about the sector in which they're working. They're there just because they are government workers, which means they have to do 9 to 5 to collect their paycheck at the end of the day. But also, there's often no accountability for these services because you don't have any choice in which services you use. So if the one that for cerebral palsy is terrible, you still have to opt into that one. There's no market incentive for a new one to be created. So you have to accept things like, services that are bad value for money. You have to accept carers who don't care for you, etc. How do we fix it? We create an incentive for competition between private companies, and that emerges as a good thing. 4 reasons why. 1, startups now have incentives. To be created in areas that are, that are more niche, but also in ways that are able to provide to people in specific categories. Also note the fact that they have incentives to do things like be more localized. They have incentives to employ local people, employ local therapists. Second of all, we note the fact that there's emotional incentives to create these businesses, that people have experience with illnesses or disabilities themselves, and now they can actually make money out of it, so they have an incentive to do that. Thirdly, people have an incentive to cater now, as I explained, to market niches because people have more money to spend on those services, so that the cost you have to sink in at the start seems less because you'll be able to generate more of that in the long term because the market needs to be filled. And note the fact that market forces will exist in this area like any others, which means yes, there's probably going to be more disability services for like ADHD than there will for people with like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, but there's obviously still going to be some of each one, and the market will allocate that in a way that is good. Fourthly though, we know that there'd be information for consumers to pick and choose between these services, in that there's things like consumer metrics, in that there's reviews. So if someone is giving you a terrible service, you don't return to them, and likely that service then eventually shuts down, which is probably good at the point where it's not providing any benefit to people who have that disability. What are the benefits of those private services over the pre-existing public ones? Fourfold. 1, it just improves your cost efficacy. Because know that people are being financially drained at the moment, because they can be extorted by disability services that don't provide any meaningful return to them. Second of all, why do you think for-profit is good in the disability services sector? Because we want this sector to be efficient like any other. Note the fact in the same way we think it's good to have for-profit arts sectors, it's also good to have for-profit disability sectors, in that is just the best way to increase the efficiency. It means you attract things like really good doctors and counsellors and therapists to come into this sector now instead of working for private hospitals. They now have incentives to work for private disability clinics, and that is obviously good. The government has an extremely tight budget, which means that it's hard for them to allocate resources to disability services to improve them at the point where they've already ticked it off in their budget. Because it's politically difficult to justify disability services at the point where only a few people in society actually benefit for them. It's not particularly politically palatable to create these services. Doing this is far, far better. Fourthly, we know that the quality of these services massively improves for a few reasons. 1, you can do better specialisation because now you have incentives to cater for a market niche. Know that that's exactly what investors who are a little bit risky are likely to do, which means that vulnerable people are far better off because the government has no incentive to create a disability service in a regional centre that's only going to cater for, they don't know how many people it's going to cater for, but investors do because they can actually make a huge amount of money of it. And maybe that means that it's expensive for those people to get that treatment, but at least they are able to seek that treatment now. In the status quo, they are literally unable to do that and have to drive hours and hours away to access it. Secondly though, it provides an incentive for innovation because note that it means you can do things like trial and test different techniques and like ways of therapy that you can't do under the status quo because you don't have those profit incentives to give it a chance. Yeah, closing.
Will you introduce antitrust legislation to ensure there are no effective monopolies in this care?
Yeah, sure, but also it's also yeah, that's fine, but also I think that even at the point where maybe there's a monopoly for some form of disabilities, that's not the worst thing in the world. Often monopolies can actually just be super super efficient. Like, they can't extort people to the point where people will just uprise and get really angry, but even if they can, the services are probably pretty good, like that's totally fine. Second of all, why do we think it empowers individual agency? Note the first thing to point out here is that at the moment, people with disabilities have no choice over the services that they consume, and we think that people with disabilities should be able to opt into different services at the point where they are not a homogenous group, because we know the fact that for some people, it's more important to be able to spend money driving to see your family than it is to getting therapy. But also, some people with disabilities sometimes are worse than they are at other points, so sometimes they need services and sometimes they do not. What this money allows them to do is decide when to use that money and what to use it on. And the impact of that is fourfold. Firstly, we know that they feel more empowered because now they feel like they have choice over their treatment at the point where they can opt out of something that is making them feel bad, or opt out of something that is potentially abusive. That is a huge benefit. Second of all, it's much more specialised, so if someone has a connection with one therapist over another, they have choice between that. Thirdly, it gives them financial freedom. Note the fact that these individuals are often locked out of the workplace as well, and this gives them money that they otherwise would not have on top of regular welfare that they receive. And when they feel like they have choice and freedom over where they spend that money, that makes them feel financially empowered in a way that is very important and a way that we should grant them. Fourthly though, we know that the public is more likely to support this because the rhetoric under the status quo of not supporting disability services is that only so few people use it and they see it being wasted and no one at the centres. That can no longer happen when you're providing them with money in their hand and when they're stimulating the economy, which is something that people often use as rhetoric, and that is something that is good, particularly in the current economic environment. At the end of this, it is so abundantly clear why services in the private sector are better. We should treat disabled people like we treat any other industry trying to govern.
Okay, thanks very much for that speech. And whenever you're ready, I'd like to invite the Leader of the Opposition to begin the opposition bench.
Like Cheshire Cat.
Oh, it has nothing to do with the privacy. I think I just was really good. I supported it. Those actually have implications for our extension.
Sure, his closing team denies that sort of extension.
I like, no.
No. I agree with their setup. I'm not going to say anything.
Okay, that's obviously timestamp.
You can deduct some speaks from me. So many of the claims made by that opening government team are true up to every premise other than the conclusion. Because they say, well, it's speculative how many people would use a rural service. But that suggests that the private industry is unlikely to invest in it because they need a profitable return, but it can still be good for governments too, because even if it doesn't get used by a lot of people, they're the ones who are able to sink that cost because it looks good to say that we've invested in rural health. They say people won't support it if you can see it being wasted. Yes, that's why we should directly give people wheelchairs and not have stories in the Daily Telegraph about how people were taking their disability payments down to the pokies. Ours is the form that is likely to be far more popular. I'm going to do three things in this speech. First, I'm going to talk about why our form is more popular, so it'll be more funded into the long term. Secondly, I'm going to explain why we get more efficiency in the way that we provide it, such that with the same amount of money we can do far more good for people. And finally, I will explain why agency is not an important consideration in this debate, and is in fact better on our side. Let's start with why our form of services is likely to be far more popular. 4 reasons. First, because there's less talk of it being stolen by people who aren't really disabled. That's to say that there's a lot of media narratives that suggest people don't actually need these kinds of services. They're just on it, they're faking their disability. But there's no reason to fake your disability if what you're getting is help with that disability. You only have that incentive if you are getting money, and that means that it can't be spun as people faking it. Second, there's less ability to say that people don't really need the money for what they're doing, because clearly we're only giving them things that would be helpful if they needed it. Third, they can't say that it's being used improperly. You can't say that people are making the wrong choice, people are too stupid or are too whatever other thing you think about them to be able to actually effectively help themselves, so it's likely to be more popular. Fourth, with this form of spending more directly creates jobs, there's a larger political incentive for it. So yes, on their side it's speculatively through a system where the market creates jobs secondarily, but that's much less politically popular than going to an aged care home, cutting the ribbon and posing with the old people and looking at all these new nursing jobs that you've created. All of this suggests that our form of spending is far more popular. The final thing I want to note here is that those workers there in this world are then able to strike for the conditions of the patients that they're taking care of, who they often deeply care about. Because you can't strike for a larger stipend because your work isn't related to that stipend, but you can strike for more funding of the services that you're helping people. Why is it being more popular incredibly impactful in this debate? First, it's far less likely to get cut into the long term, and it's far more likely to be improved. Secondly, it's far more likely to become a political issue that people care about, which is how you stop soft or ways of cutting it that don't get media attention. Things like not indexing it to inflation. Third, it means that there's no reason to restrict access to it, because when you're worried about this being stolen, what you do is you put in a whole load of bureaucratic barriers to accessing it, which means that to test that people actually need it. And that means that there's more bureaucratic barriers for people who actually do need it. People who, for instance, might have English as a second language and aren't capable of going through the administrative process get locked out on their side because we need to put in all of those barriers. That means that it's far, far harder to access for them, and that brings us to debate on its own, because their claim is that the efficiency of how it's being used. We explain how we simply get far, far more money. Second claim, why does it get more efficiently used? A bunch of reasons. First, we can bargain with the providers of these goods on a far larger scale, which reduces the price significantly. And the reason for that is that if you're a company and you're selling it to a whole bunch of people, you can afford to raise the price such to leave some consumers out because you'll still make more money. But if you're having to bargain directly with the state on such a mass scale, and you're only one person is going to get the contract and they have to make it cheap, that means that you can reduce the price. Second, it's cheaper because no one is taking out a profit margin as a result of this, and when there has to be a profit margin, that means the price necessarily has to go up. Third, I'll note that this industry is particularly inefficient and there often isn't a lot of competition. Three reasons. First, due to the presence of things like patents, because we're often talking about medical technology. Second, they're very concentrated due to things like mergers. And third, the shortage of employees in a lot of these, for instance, aged care or disability sectors, means it's incredibly hard to start up because employees don't want to leave their job in order to jump ship to a new one, which means that there often aren't enough employees to start in the first instance, which suggests there's not a lot of competition in this industry, and also suggests that you're far more likely to get higher prices in this industry. Did someone just ask a point? Yep.
Do you support the abolishment of private health insurance?
No. So, in terms of the next reason why it's more efficient is the government actually has more of an incentive to make this industry far more efficient in our world because it's directly costing them money. So, the government is far more likely to do good things like antitrust law. The government is far more likely to break things up. The government is far more likely to regulate it to avoid crowd gouging when it is directly costing the government money rather than costing individuals money, which suggests that this would be a far more efficient industry on our side. The fourth reason why it's more efficient on our side is that state-owned disability services are less inclined to take advantage of people, to do things like convince them that they need care they don't need, to overcharge them when they're unable to access other services. And I'll note that the people we're talking about are often particularly vulnerable to coercion. They're often people who have mental impairments, they're often people who are older, and private for-profit companies have an incentive to take advantage of them, to do things like set up recurring payments that keep on taking money out of their account. And that means that actually often these private services aren't just not as good as ours, they're actively harmful. They take advantage of people for the profit incentive. That profit incentive doesn't exist on our side, which means that which means that they're less likely to take advantage of people. Also note it's an incredibly difficult to regulate industry in this instance. First, it's very hard to know what the interaction that happens in someone's bedroom with a healthcare worker is, and secondly, because often you don't want to regulate the private industry because they'll say that you're restricting the supply of access to things like healthcare workers. The next reason why we get more is that state-owned services put less burden on the individual to access them, because state-owned services will do things like directly contact the people who need access to these services and provide them with those services. They will do things like continue to provide them. That's to say that my grandmother would never go out and seek a service on her own because she thinks she's still 25. Apparently the guy who did her driving test said she was the best driver he'd ever seen. And what that means is that she can't be trusted to actually make the decision on her care on her own. You need someone who will come in, and often we are talking about people who aren't able to make that decision themselves, who are in a particularly vulnerable state, and state-owned services put far less burden on the individual to seek out their own care in instances when they are unable to. The next reason it's more efficient is because the private sector won't go into places without enough demand. Things like niche diseases, things like rural areas, because there isn't enough. And I know there's a short-term subsidy from opening government, but even if because obviously they can only support a short-term subsidy, anything else would be outside the bench. And if you have a short-term subsidy, but there isn't a long-term market opportunity, obviously that that industry is simply likely to die. So we get far more actors in those kinds of niche diseases. Therefore, their claim here is, well, there's no competition, there's no market incentive. There isn't a market incentive. We provide an electoral incentive, and an incredibly large electoral incentive, because people care a lot about things like aged care and disability services. So on the way, why is an electoral incentive better than a market incentive? First, there's an incentive towards helping people, rather than helping people the most direct, helping people who are the wealthiest, which means that our incentive is far better, because everyone has one vote, whereas the wealthy people can spend far more money. Secondly, it's a far more long-term incentive, the electoral incentive. That's to say that it's unlikely that money would be taken out if there are other, more appealing investment opportunities. The electoral incentive will always exist, which suggests why we get better services on our side. They say it's better on their side as a result of agency, because people can make the decisions. First, the majority of the money they're receiving isn't in their disability stipend, it's in either from their job or other forms of stipend, like other forms of welfare or the age pensions. They still have agency of that. But secondly, state-run services also allow you agency to choose who you are likely to access, to choose when you're likely to access it. For instance, you have mental health vouchers in New South Wales that you're allowed to use at any time with any therapist. Obviously, to the degree that agency is good, state-run services have an incentive to give you that agency.
Thanks very much for that speech, and now I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the OG case whenever you're ready.
What about speech was actually just kind of fake? Like, what's with the false binary between electoral and market incentives? Our side very explicitly both combines electoral and market incentives, because if a person hasn't actually received a good quality service for the stipend that they've got, they can't be able to access a quality service if it's not enough money. The government can't just wash its hands clean and still get their vote. They're just like, no, the government's failing, they should be stepping in to do something. What I think that means, you get the best of both worlds under our side, because you get both companies engaging in market incentives, competing within each other to give the best quality services, and also the government stepping in to ensure and regulate where that has gone wrong. Like, what? And what I think that means is we arrive at a kind of golden benefit that this section of most developed economies is really cash-strapped. They have a very finite pool of funding to be able to give to disability services, and I understand that typically bureaucratic bloat isn't considered the most emotionally intense or high-impact argument, but it actually is just immediately debate-winning. Because the immense amount of extra funding that these government departments have to just waste because they just don't have the competition incentives to generate high quality and cost efficient products means that people on the ground just get less services. They have less money to be able to pay for the expenses that they need in their lives. Meaning, ultimately, that question alone wins us the debate. I'm going to respond to 4 different arguments. I'm going to start with the analysis on captured markets. Because side opposition, I think, really needs to undercut the question of competition. I think it's very unlikely that the type of world that they describe, where, you know, these companies can do whatever they want to do with impunity, comes to fruition. The reasons are threefold. The first is because oftentimes these are highly localized types of services. What monopoly? I just don't understand. They didn't give any mechanism about how you're likely to form monopolies. In fact, the inverse happens. These type of niche markets with very small amounts of demand, where is your economy of scale? There is little benefit in centralizing your control because you have limited customer growth in the first place. What I think that means is that you get small local communities that provide local services to different people with disabilities in their local communities. And that ensures, firstly, greater mobility, because yes, it's a little bit expensive to move over to another community or town to access services there, but it's an option if your local services are terrible. But secondly, it's because competition is so much easier. Because expanding or trying to compete across local communities is very easy. And what I think that means is this is a functional private market, and certainly not a monopoly for reasons that have not been supplied by opposition. It's like handcrafted goods. You have small local niche demand, not what they describe. Second, regulation and intervention in this market is really easy. Like, their response is, you're more likely to break up your own public services because it's your own money? Like, what? This is still the government's own money, it's giving a stipend, it still has electoral incentives as I described in my introduction. So the actual bigger reason is whether there's greater transparency and advocacy. And that is a claim we squarely win on side opening government. Because you get to get up there in front of the public and social media, in front of the media and the general newspapers, in front of the government and say, look at the bill I have just received of this private industry. Look as a percentage how much that is taking out of my stipend. In the same way that people easily get change on the cost of insulin is too high because they can show the bill to the public, it is one that emotionally resonates with people. And that type of transparency of private bills being excessive is one that forces a government response that is positive under our side. Second, under competition. Here, I think this opposition has two broad problems. The first is they never prove high barriers of upfront costs, which means that I think we can broadly get a huge amount of companies stepping in. The reason is because disabilities is overwhelmingly about services. You don't need massive centralized controlled centers. These are local people that are providing very local and often quite hands-on, skilled experience. And I think that means is it operates much more like a local GP than it is a massive wheelchair manufacturing company or whatever. But even in the instance where it is largely centralized and there are some degrees of economies of scale, I'm still not sure why the government is great at manufacturing wheelchairs. Beats me. And their response is because there's wonderful collective bargaining. You know who's better at collective bargaining? Maybe companies in this specific instance. Because if you are a wheelchair manufacturer, I think you'd be really good at being able to efficiently allocate wheelchairs into untapped markets to drive that at the lowest possible cost. What I think that means is that companies are broadly very good at these type of actions. And then the only last thing we need to explain is why companies will step in the first place. They are so lazy here. Their response is, well, it's a niche market, so there's not much money to be made. Like, yeah, there's not much money to be made at the moment because they're all provided by public services. There's literally no space for private industries to exist because they're not allowed to provide these services because no one turns to them, right? And that immediately changes under our side. Like, imagine, overnight, there is a massive untapped market of a huge set of people that have a lot of money now to spend wherever they like. And yes, it's a little bit risky to expand into these areas. But as I explained, the upfront costs are not particularly high, which doesn't make it enormously risky. You have large amounts of potential reputational benefit to being a market leader. This is a promising expansion option. Totally unclear to me why people wouldn't take up this option. Next, they say, there's a bit of a public support problem here. And this argument, I think, has three broad problems. The first is I think we have our own response independently to the public support argument. And that is that people have a very visceral hatred of bureaucratic corruption and bureaucratic fraud. And that is because there is something reputationally insipid about the government itself, having public servants that are taking a slice off the top unjustly. There's something deeply, just fundamentally that feels wrong about that makes the public particularly incensed. Whereas their responses to this is just like, but you'll get some images of people spending the money on the pokies, where it's, I think, a little bit less clear that the type of stereotype would operate in the same way with disabilities as welfare. Actually, before I'll go on, I'll take closer.
Yeah, so your entire argument would suggest that we should abolish all forms of public education because the private sector will just do it better. You want to talk about that?
Education is a natural monopoly, whereas this is not, yeah? Big economies of scale in education, this not. There's a whole case. Like, please, listen, I don't know. Under public support, I think the big positive reasons we give here are, yes, there will be some images of people spending money on the pokies. It's relatively easy for the government to dismantle some of these narratives through extent of deliberate narratives, but also I think these people tend to be quite sympathetic in a way that people on welfare are not, because it isn't a choice that individuals have made, it's often something that they're born with. Their last response here is like, but public workers can unionize and strike, and they'll really lobby hard for this. As if private individuals that are now being employed aren't also going to lobby the government under our side. I just don't think they're very comparative here. The last argument, perhaps the worst that they make, is on agency. And their argument here is, look, private companies firstly will be seen as untrustworthy, which has to be the way to immediately end your business, because you are premised upon having a good quality reputation that your services are reasonably high quality. And if you are deliberately preying on disabled people, you are going to get hammered by the media and hammered by customers. And as such, I do think that we should be polite to people and trust that they do have good agency and can make good decisions with their own money, like any other set of people. They're not especially irrational, and as such, we're very proud to propose.
Okay, thanks very much for that speech. And now I'd like to welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to conclude the opening.
I'm going to answer a very simple question in the speech, which is self-evidently the most important question in the debate. Which is better? When the public provide these services, or when we have private services? I'm going to split it into three parts. Firstly, on which side you get better geographic access to these services. Secondly, on which side you get better financial access. And thirdly, on which side you get higher quality services. Firstly then, on geographic access. Their claim is now you get more rural centres, and the only way they mechanise this is by explaining that, well, they would be happy to fund the establishment of these rural centres in the first instance in order to get them operating. The first problem with this is it's obviously in rural areas there just are very few people with disabilities. And in many of those instances they struggle to support general hospitals for the entire population, which makes it very unclear how exactly you get the market for these institutions to exist. And to the extent they say, well, it's not that difficult to set up a small institution, the problem is when you have a service worker whose job is visiting homes once a week, you can't do that if there are a small group of people in that area because they don't have enough to fully hire the number of people required. But it's also just makes sure that they actually are able to convince someone to come out and work in a rural area if they can't organically draw from the population of that area to get a high-skilled aged care worker or disability worker. But secondly, even if they say governments would set up these institutions, which I just think they have insufficient capital to do, right? But they can only do what it says in the motion, not a bunch of extra stuff. I think that wouldn't be able to sustain in time, or certainly at least wouldn't be able to expand in time if the population of that area changed, or the number of disabled people, or the type of disabled people in that area that changed. But thirdly, look, maybe this goes, maybe governments do focus on cities a little bit, but clearly private companies focus on cities in those areas far more. Firstly, because it's optically bad when governments choose to be like rural communities or poor communities, because those communities then are able to have images of their suffering portrayed in the media. But secondly, governments frequently engage in other forms of redistribution, for example, the way they redistribute taxes or redistribute funding towards education. So it's unclear why that type of redistribution wouldn't occur now. That redistribution incentive doesn't exist from their side. This is important because access in the first instance to a service where you live is the most important part of actually getting that service to you, and it's a prerequisite before things like financial costs. And it's the largest delta in the debate because even if the care is slightly worse, some people actually having that access is the most important. No. Secondly, why do we get more financial access on our side? The first way we did this is just by explaining that the stipend that would be distributed would be small, or even if it started large, it would get defunded. The way that they try to explain the stipend would be large is by saying, well, this would be popular because we portray it as stimulating the economy. The first and obvious flaw in this is just that if you're portraying it as stimulating the economy, then during inflationary periods when people are concerned about the amount of stimulation of the economy that is occurring, these types of investments into stimulants are the first thing to get cut, for good reason, because they are causing inflation. Comparatively, there is no incentive to cut things like the amount that you are funding a physical disability service when you are in an inflationary period, which most of the world is empirically in right now. But secondly, I would just point out this isn't an intuition that everyone shares, and it's obviously symmetric to the extent that also funding a physical disability service creates jobs which people enjoy and would find extremely popular. I think we also just give you a bunch of reasons at map why it is that our services would be better funded. That is, firstly, it doesn't rely on trusting the people to spend their money well. It's not associated with other forms of welfare which conservative governments love to cut. And you also get the workers campaigning to increase funding, not just the disabled people campaigning to increase funding, which is an added incentive for government to continue to raise it. The next way we beat this argument is by pointing out that the market would just be monopolistic and ineffective. That is, firstly, because it's inelastic. Secondly, because it's specialised, which means difficult to enter into. And thirdly, because even when there isn't a higher upfront cost, there's worker shortages in these areas, which means new competitors to the market aren't able to establish sufficient worker bases and get employees in order to perform the functions that they need. They say, well, we would just have price caps. The problem with this is often disability services are just very expensive, right? Like you have to try out a skilled worker. That skilled worker has to do lots of hours constantly caring for an individual, and they require specialized equipment to do that work. Which means that if you set a price cap on that service that is below the market cost of that service, some part of that operation has to be cut and becomes significantly worse. So maybe they set a price cap on it, but that just means the service gets worse. On our side, for obvious reasons, the government is subsidizing the performance of that care because they are literally the ones running it and providing it, and they aren't expecting to make a profit when they do so. I'll take it later. Next, they say, well, there are no economies of scale here, so it's unclear why they would be monopolistic. Three ways that there are economies of scale. The first is the centralization of manufacturing. Lots of goods that different disability services require are just things that they all need, and therefore a singular government-wide distribution center can be built to fix that. But secondly, you can also centralize things like the training of workers and their entrance into the workforce, for example, through things like grad programs which ensure that workers get the necessary training they need to move from having a university degree or a TAFE degree to actually being able to function like perform that task in the workforce. But thirdly, also the centralization of admin work. For example, when you need to run a business, you need to hire a CEO, and CEOs are just something that is a skill which is in demand, which means in order to get someone competent to run your company, you need to expend $400,000 a year in order to actually get that person. Having one CEO rather than many is really just a clear way of getting economies of scale. Okay, closing.
Who do you think pays more for replacement aircraft part, Qantas or the Department of Defense?
I don't know. Don't run your extension, I don't care. Alright, next let's talk about the quality of services. Obviously this is less important than previous to the reason that I've already explained, which is that getting access to these services is a prerequisite in order to improve this. Alright, firstly, the first claim they make then in terms of why they get better quality of work is just that, well, they are able to specialise and therefore improve. The first issue with this is obviously governments to a very similar extent are able to specialise and compartmentalise the types of work that they're able to do, which means that, yes, okay, maybe you get an entirely new company running this specific service, but it's unclear to me how that specialisation is any better than a faction of the government department specialising in doing their job really well. And obviously the work is the same on either side, they're just being employed by different employers. So it's unclear to me exactly what that specialisation is achieving. But secondly, I just don't think specialisation in this particular instance is that useful, given that there are very standardised ways of employing these types of care. And the type of care they're doing is the type of care that we've done for literally hundreds of years or at least decades in many instances, which means specialising in performing that care extra well provides only a marginal benefit. The next claim they make then is, well, there's no competition, which means people can't opt out. The first issue with this is it obviously doesn't compete with the electoral sentiment we provide, which says that even if you can't opt out of the service, the fact that you have to opt into it means that people care about making that service particularly good, which creates huge electoral incentive to ensure that those who need to access those services are able to access them well. And secondly, obviously, this relies on there being many services that you could choose between, which we explained is not true. Why then we provide the biggest contribution from the state? We're on 3 fronts. Firstly, we're the team that proves you that you get rural services. And I would note, even that sounds like an instant win button, it is just an instant win button because we provide services that otherwise wouldn't exist for a set of people that desperately need them. In and of itself is a large enough contribution to the debate. But secondly, we explain you get better financial costs because even if you believe that they aren't that expensive, you should believe our analysis about why this would get defunded, the stipend wouldn't be large enough to cover these costs. And thirdly, we explain that the quality of their services is actually better. And even if they pay higher costs for stuff, we think that's fine. They get enough funding to pay those costs anyway.
Thanks very much for that speech, and whenever you're ready, I'd like to invite the Member of Government to begin the closing half of this debate.
When disabled people have the choice of how to spend their money, yes, a lot of them end up going into private institutions, but a very likely counterfactual is many of them end up staying at home and are cared for by their family. My first extension will be explaining why we provide more family care in this debate and why that's the most important impact within this round. Obviously, state-provided services and how they operate in the status quo is that they are organised and provided by institutional provider with government-employed staff, which means that disabled people end up in care homes, disability clinics, or community centres. And they have no choice to stay at home, firstly, because the only way that they can access the services that the government has put money into providing and that disability infrastructure is to go to these centres. And obviously, most of these disabled people have mobility issues or need help getting to and from places, which means they usually just stay in these places for a large part of the week or almost all the time, permanently. And secondly, because there's a huge family on family members who don't have the sufficient capital to actually care for these people while juggling their life, their job, and all that kind of stuff, which means that they're more likely to just want to leave these disabled family members at these clinics. What is the change that we get? Disabled people now have the discretionary counsel to stay at home because firstly, they have money to set up disability infrastructure within their own homes. Whether it's buying a blood pressure monitor that can automatically call the ambulance when their blood pressure gets too high. Whether they can renovate homes to reduce physical risk, for example, if they have Asperger's and they have a poor risk assessment of the dangers in the house. Whether it's installing wheelchair accessibility in their own home so their family don't have to lift them every time time they want to go somewhere, those are things that are very, very useful. Secondly, they have the money to get in-call services on demand. For example, hiring a nurse that can come in part-time. Thirdly, and most importantly, they can alleviate the financial pressure on their families. This looks like, firstly, family members not feeling like these people are a burden on their family when caring for them because they can spend government money on purchasing equipment on them. But secondly, it means that we can use this money to, for example, send family members to training programs so they understand how to better care for their grandmother. But thirdly, the governments can provide stipends as an allowance for full-time family carers, and that's really good because it can effectively work as a wage. What is the impact of this? Superficially, family members are just better carers because they better understand the needs of people within their family. But more importantly, and this is the most unique benefit in this debate, they can provide emotional and pastoral care. Disabled people feel far less lonely when they can stay within a family, when there's kids and there's, the children around them. There's somebody who can listen to their concern, listen to the struggles that they go through. And this extra care is fundamentally important because a government nurse is going to make sure you're fed, but they're never going to go that extra step to make sure you're happy. A government nurse doesn't get out of bed at night worrying about you and checking up on you, making sure you're okay. A government nurse doesn't care about your dignity. If there's food on your mouth, they're not going to clean it up because they don't think it matters what you look like because you can't perceive that anyway if you're mentally disabled. But a family member does care about that because they emotionally care for you. This is the most unique benefit in this debate. Every side can give mechanisms as to why you can regulate more efficient services or better equipment, but no side except CG can claim the emotional pastoral benefit of family members truly be able to provide that emotional care for you. Closing, do you have a point?
Okay. Yes, so programs exist to pay family carers directly, but they don't involve the disabled person receiving a stipend and then paying them. They receive the money directly from the government, and this motion provides that your side has to spend money directly to the disabled person.
Sure, so that was my third mechanism. My second mechanism was that you buy the equipment, family members can buy them. My first mechanism is that the disabled people can give the money to the family members so that they can go to training programs. Obviously, this is an additional allowance that allows for additional instances of family care. You can claim the benefit maybe a little bit under your side. Second extension is why the involvement of corporations creates political change for disabled people. This is best engaged with opening opposition. Toomey is like, well, disabled people are really bad at making discretionary choices and advocating for their own rights, and uses that to sink opening government. Opening government's like, well, free market, people have choice, and all that kind of stuff. And obviously, the general population is very apathetic and doesn't really campaign for disabled people. Under our word, corporations are highly involved in disabled care because obviously some section of the market, as OG explains, still goes to private institutions, but also because they often provide the in-call nurses and train them, but also because they manufacture the kinds of equipment we talk about now, extensions such as heart monitors and all that kind of stuff. And their profit is almost entirely based on the spending of disabled customers, but that money isn't money that those disabled people earn, but that money directly comes from the government, and the government controls the lever of that spending. And this is a very simple mechanism. Large profit-seeking entities will lobby and campaign for disabled support because the welfare of the disabled people is exactly and precisely how they make money. Closing, do you have a POI? What's your extension?
Yeah, sure. What happens with people, isn't there an enormous opportunity cost to giving people who do not currently have carers, full-time carers, when compared to putting a government-funded facility?
So, firstly, we outweigh that because even if there's marginally less, infrastructural care for individuals, we would say that emotional care is more important than, for example, having a slightly more advanced wheelchair. But the second thing to say is this second extension will prove why we get more money on net, which means that the efficiency trade-off does not go in the way that you predict it will. So, we explained that large profit-seeking operations will lobby and campaign for new disability support. The easiest way to do this and the easiest way to make more money if you're this company is just to campaign for the stipend to increase, because then disabled people can spend more money and can earn more money. But secondly, they can also push for greater corporate subsidies, and that covers all those things about how the short subsidies are only short term. They can say, well, you really need to care about disabled people, we really need this better equipment. And lastly, they can change regulations that make it easy to operate. For example, telling the government you need to provide visas for immigrant workers to come over so that they can be disability carers, for example. This is obviously really, really important because firstly, we just get net more money on our side, which is a premise opening government never proved. But secondly, we literally break down the kinds of stigmas OO talks about because these corporations will appeal to public sympathy. They'll fund political ads that say we should care about our grandmas with Alzheimer's. They'll put pictures of people with Asperger's on the train billboards so people care about them and feel like they need to vote for governments who have empathy for them and will actually raise the stipends for them. This is
by far the most, my first extension is the most important claim in this debate. The second one is also very, very important for the reason that we flip OO's claims about all the criticisms about corporations, and if CO runs arguments additionally about monopolization, that deals with that as well. Because the more monopolized and more powerful these companies are, the better they're able to lobby, and perversely, corporate capture becomes a really good thing for our side, because disabled people who otherwise do not have a voice, disabled people who otherwise do not have an ability to advocate their interests, now have the greatest ally on their side, which is rich, profit-seeking corporations that can influence government. That prevents the kind of defunding efforts OO talks about. That prevents the kind of paycheck-stealing narratives that OO talk about. That prevents disabled people from being left in the dust, because we provide familial care and we get a voice for them in that process. Very proud to propose. Do you break?
Yep.
That's fine. Well, actually, that's kind of weird. I was going to ask, I'm really going to go to the bathroom.
Yeah, no worries.
Every other team in this debate conceives of disability as an individual issue, and it certainly is that. But more importantly, we think at closing opposition, disability is a public health issue, one which requires government to collect data and information to be able to craft solutions in both worlds effectively, to allocate resources in such a way that people aren't left with shortages, that people aren't left with bed sores because there literally aren't enough resources to look after people with disabilities. Two contributions from CO. Firstly, why government-run facilities are necessary to gather the necessary public health data to craft effective disability policy into the future, which is a necessary precondition for effective policy in either world. Then secondly, what happens to people with pretty profound disabilities and bad guardians and carers, and the fact that they can use this as a way to exploit them. Let's talk about public health data. The simple premise of this extension is that governments need information on disability in society to make assessments on policy. How prevalent is this particular kind of condition? How likely is it going to be in the future? How many specialists do we need to train? What is the best practice for treating and managing these particular disabilities? What kind of incentives do we need to set up to make sure we have enough future disability support workers? Do we need to build more facilities, and where? How much of the health budget or the overall government budget do we need to allocate? And over the long term, this is by far the most critical impact in the debate, because it is the only way to ensure that there is capacity in either world to set up facilities to help people with disabilities, to know about those issues in advance rather than scrambling for a solution after the fact. Because it's a necessary precondition. It determines how big your stipend must be. It determines who is eligible for that stipend and for how much. It determines what facilities should exist, how to ration resources going into the future. So, why is it then that private facilities fail to provide sufficient data compared to government services to allow for that, the most important benefit in the debate, to come to fruition? We think there are 5 reasons. Firstly, private facilities have a much greater incentive to distort their data or omit things in order to downplay how they might be failing their customers, because obviously it reflects poorly on them if they are releasing information saying we are doing not a great job of treating our customers with this kind of disability. They obviously have a strong incentive to cover that up. Secondly, in terms of their capacity to cover it up, it's much harder to enforce, to get accurate information out of these private providers relative to government services, which get audited more regularly, which are exposed to significantly more media and public scrutiny, which are exposed to things like parliamentary inquiries from government departments, which obviously have far more internal accountability compared to a private corporation, which is accountable either to like a bunch of startup guys or shareholders, who obviously do not have those same incentives to reveal shortcomings and failures, and they don't have certainly the electoral incentive, which Owen already talked about. Thirdly, it's the fact that they don't report directly to public departments, like they don't set policy on how these facilities are run, which means that governments don't get that data directly. Even if they do get it, it's certainly much slower. Fourthly, they engage in far more cost-cutting practices, so they don't do things like bring in specialist researchers to develop the best practice of care or make reforms focused on the quality of care, because they don't have those incentives in the same way that government disability provision does. And fifthly, the fact that governments induce demand by investing heavily in this sector, by creating future opportunities, means that is the only way you're able to incentivize things like research into disabilities, the only way you're able to heavily incentivize things like changing the incentives of like university grants in terms of allocating more positions in like behavioural neuroscience, in terms of funding for particular disabilities, in terms of research into particular conditions, something that is far less likely under the higher level of risk, where you have to rely on a private company employing you to do that in order to make a living, compared to a government job, which is far more stable, far more reliable going into the future. And we think this is a tipping point for the long-term change, because when there is less data, even a marginal decrease in the amount or the quality of data you have available has enormous ramifications for the long-term ability of governments to work out how much money do we need to spend on disabilities and in what fashion. And that explains why we beat every other team in this debate, because it's a precondition for you to believe opening opposition's material about efficiency. Efficiency doesn't matter that much as if you're not efficiently doing good things, or if you don't have the resources necessary to allocate them in the sufficient quantity. It beats opening government because it explains that competition only goes so far if there literally just aren't enough resources to be allocated by these stipends in the first place, if there aren't facilities in place. It beats closing government because emotional support matters probably less than whether or not someone with a disability has a carer looking after them, or their ability to participate in politics. That is the first reason that closing opposition, I think, very comfortably wins that debate. Before I move on, opening?
Yeah, private researchers provide the most cutting-edge research and data because they have the access to most facilities. Why are they so evil that they have an incentive to directly screw over their own customers?
Well, it's not that they have an incentive to be evil, although certainly some of them do, like the Royal Commission and aged care private facilities are obviously not too great. But it's the fact that companies don't have a private incentive to do that additional research because they're already getting money from the stipend system. They don't have the incentive to make the quality of that care significantly better if they're already profiting to a significant degree, and it's unclear how much more you can beat the competition by bringing in an incredibly expensive cutting-edge researcher, particularly if you believe your own mechanism that we would enforce anti-monopoly, and these are smaller companies, they don't have the budget for that kind of thing if you believe your best case characterization to begin with. Second extension though, and this I think responds more directly to closing government, is just to explain that there are a significant number of people with pretty profound disabilities and have guardians and carers who do not actually do a good job of looking after them, and it should be taken out of their hands. And we think this is a particularly important group to care about because obviously they're extremely vulnerable, they have no viable alternatives, they have very limited capacity to do things like consent. I would suggest that there are a lot of families who view their disabled family member as a burden rather than someone that they actually care about and love equally. That is particularly difficult in, for instances, where you have a child who is extremely strongly autistic, or for instance, you have someone who is physically unable to contribute and you're from an already poor background, as is likely for a lot of disabled people, or maybe you're being looked after by quite a jaded carer who just isn't doing all they can anymore for you, even if they perhaps once did. We think that the government model then is terrible for three reasons. Firstly, it creates a middleman where these bad actors, who do exist in a lot of circumstances, have an opportunity to siphon these funds. And it's really difficult to hold them accountable because the government transfers money into the account of this disabled person or their carer, but the disability provider, before they go to that service, doesn't know, we're going to get this money. So there's no actual way to blow the whistle and work out this money is actually being misused and misdirected, which means it's very likely that this money is actually not going towards the care of this disabled person. That's obviously a more important contribution than Owen's material about efficiency, because it's not about how efficiently that money is used, it's does this get used on that disabled person at all, which is obviously a much more important consideration. Secondly, it's the fact that a lot of these disabled people are quite dependent on support from these bad carers. They need to be driven to facilities to receive care in a lot of cases, and it's not actually always clear that this happens. Neglect is very sadly common with people who are quite strongly disabled, which means it's actually unclear that the benefits that closing government talk about accumulate in a lot of circumstances, and even if they do, then you have to weigh them against the fact that this enables far more exploitation than when the government directly looks after these people, which they are much more likely to do. But thirdly, I would explain that even in situations where, even in that responding more directly to their best case, about care in the home, as I flagged in a point of information, it is obviously much more efficient and feasible for a government facility to look after people than having to find full-time carers for all of these people, which is incredibly expensive and leaves them incredibly vulnerable. The most important thing in this debate was the long term, and it was only closing opposition who got you the data needed to get ready for that. That's why we win this debate.
In response to all of the material that we get on monopolization, a very simple observation from me, and that's just that this debate isn't actually really about who provides the service at all. It's about who buys the service. Should the service be bought by the government and given to disabled people, or should it be bought by disabled people directly? And that's an incredibly powerful observation, because all that that establishes is just that actually these markets already exist because the goods and the services are both provided privately on both sides, i.e. pharmaceuticals, i.e. a lot of the care services are subcontracted out to private providers in the model of government, empirically in countries that do this, and that obviously extremely and clearly applies to things like equipment. What is interesting about this then is that you should evaluate this debate on a question, and this clash especially, on a question of should the government act as a middleman who purchases from a private sector and then allocates, or should we just let disabled people purchase from that market directly itself? And what is incredibly important about this is that the observation that follows from this is that actually when the government is the only purchaser of these products, that is the much more powerful and an additional bit of extension that is a response and thus can be credited as not new material equipped. That is the far bigger problem when it comes to why these industries are monopolized. That's why I asked that POI to Charlie that unfortunately confused them. Because the answer to it is simple. The Department of Defense spends far more money on things like aircraft parts. The reason for that is that it's very hard to access things like government procurement processes and to sell to a government. It's very easy to sell to private players, so Qantas doesn't spend very much. What's interesting about that is that that observation explains why, when the government is the buyer, that's what causes monopolies in many instances, worsens concentration of the market. But when you bring this market into the light, you actually make it a consumer-facing market instead of just a market to supply to the government. That is far, far better. There are 3 reasons why consumers create the grounds for better competition. The first one is consumers are far more risk-tolerant than governments. They're willing to take a punt on new services. That means that now companies can compete on the basis of innovating, but instead the government would usually not bother to take the risk. And that information never makes its way to the market in that world, which means that there's no backlash when the government just says it won't fund experimental therapies. Nobody knows that they exist. The second one is that consumers also demand very different things on an individual level, which means that, for instance, one consumer might prefer a wheelchair with a more rigid body that provides them better support. Another consumer might have slightly different mobility needs and prefer a more soft body wheelchair. That means then that there are different companies that can crop up to cater to those more specialized markets. When this happens through the government, the efficiency that they get is actually just the government places huge bulk orders for one type of thing that mostly serves people's needs okay, but isn't actually very tailored in the way that it would be if this market was directly consumer facing. All of that then means, and this is completely new analysis, not table tapping, that we don't rely on these speculative claims that opening government provides, where they say things like, oh, well, we would enforce antitrust law. We don't even need it on our side, because the most powerful way to break these monopolies that already exist on the status quo is to bring these monopolies into the light, to expose them to a consumer market that's far more responsive, far more risk tolerant. That creates the grounds for competition. That's how we actually get the benefits of the competition that opening government describes, because obviously they do not even explain their antitrust claim anyway. So what does that mean? 1, this defeats opening opposition's claims on bargaining, because it proves that actually when the government is doing the bargaining, that makes this entire industry far worse. It means the government spends far, far more money. And I guess they'll say things like accountability, and they say things like the public service is pretty good. But it's actually not very good, because when you think about how governments do things like procurements, this is something that literally like 10 to 15 people in a singular department would manage in many instances. They're the people who manage these contracts, reach out to private enterprise. The second thing though is that because governments are very risk intolerant, very scared of things like scandals, that means that they're incredibly unwilling to try new different players or new different contractors. So they overwhelmingly just stick to the same company again and again and again. Because you can't supply directly to consumers, that means that only that company survives and the rest fall away. And the third thing to say here is that because this is all managed in quite an untransparent, difficult way by a couple different people, it's really easy to engage in different forms of graft, different forms of being able to get influence over those people. And the last thing to say here is that overwhelmingly, that also means that in many instances, nobody just knows that this is happening. Like, that is why often incredible amounts of waste take place in the public sector, because kind of nobody really feels the harm of it in a direct way. For instance, it's nice for the public servants who manage the procurement because they get to form good relationships with the industry. Then they can get a really cushy job that pays them way more than the government does afterwards. And it's good for the government because they get to say, well, we're giving wheelchairs to people. And disabled people might think that it would be nice if they could have better services, but they don't feel the lack of them because they never experience experience them in the first place. It's very hard to collectivize in a disabled group as well, which all means then that actually there's huge scope for waste to occur. And that's why you see things like reports coming out of the American Department of Defense where they spend like hundreds of dollars on a fucking screwdriver because of the way that this is untransparent and incredibly badly done by government. That is structural and incredibly difficult to fix. It'll be too late for them to do so in opposition with. I'll take that point from opening.
This might be true of military spending, but empirically, in which type of healthcare systems are things more expensive? Single-payer systems with central budgeting or private healthcare systems?
I would say that the best system is one in which you actually have a consumer market. That's fundamentally different, right? Like, there is no real instance in many examples. There's not really many examples of a healthcare system where I go to the government for my medication, I go to a pharmacy, and I buy it from a private provider. Like, government helps to subsidize, but it isn't the purchaser, and that's what's unique here. Making it the purchaser means that all those harms become true and salient. But also, I think you can see that in a variety of different kinds of things that government does provide, right? Like, for instance, when the government buys, like, mouse pads from a private provider to put in the APS offices. There are whole working groups that get devoted to this. Massive amounts of waste. It's incredibly ridiculous. And because it's very difficult to understand how government procurement processes work as well, and to understand the different regulations that you need to follow around the way that you pitch your bid, around the way that you structure that, that's also something that's extraordinarily hard to access for a new entrant into the market. Let's then talk about what we get from closing opposition. Closing opposition says that you need to have information about these different needs in order to decide how you want to drive this industry, create innovation. But we would say at closing government that actually what is more important is for the market to know this information, because we would say as a kind of principled response to this, I suppose, but also a practical one, is that it's very, very hard and ethically challenging to make the decision about which types of diseases should be prioritized over others, which disabilities should be prioritized over others. We don't think that that should be filtered through bureaucracy and politics. We think that that's a decision the market should make on the basis of how subjectively people would value that treatment, i.e. assessments of how much they would pay for it, which indicates how valuable it is, and the size of the market, i.e. the number of people who need it, and filtering off those interactions is the better way and the more ethically correct way of doing this. Lastly, on niche groups, we explain why we actually better solve the problem of rural people on our side, because we enable carers to stay at home. That's a significant benefit when you give them money. That's probably the only way that many people in rural areas actually do get care. They only say, oh, sometimes carers are bad, but some are really good, and we get people a far better quality of life as a result of this.
Okay, thanks very much for that speech. And whenever you're ready, I'd like to invite the opposition to conclude the debate.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. Our extension, then closing government, then opening opposition. Our extension is quite simple. It is for effective public policy, but also for innovation and improvement in these services broadly into the long term, ensuring that people's diseases are taken care of, that people are not systematically neglected because their disease was not, by luck and by arbitrary factors of the universe, the most common thing, that these people receive some care as opposed to no care. And I think that's a debate-winning contribution that explains why people who, under their side of the house, would otherwise be neglected, whose diseases would probably be the most intense, even if they're not physically, but because they're the least well understood, they feel the most isolated because of this. These are the people that this side of the house cannot help. And the responses we get to this from both government teams are quite poor. They just assert that competition mechanisms will ensure that research occurs. The first thing I would point out is that one of the main arguments for monopolies in many areas is specifically that because they're not operating at thin profit margins, because there is not as much competition, they can specifically do things like use that money to engage in research and development. And the more that you believe both government teams' characterization that the services will be good at the moment for those who it is provided because people are regularly competing against each other, you should believe that therefore there's not a huge surplus of capital that people can use to invest in things that are not particularly well understood, that are incredibly capital intensive, that require incredibly long periods amount of funding and studies for researchers. It is just incredibly unclear that this response was in any way charitable. But the second reason why they its response to our extinction is wrong. It's just that, like, obviously, even in the short term, like, or even if you had surplus capital, it's not clear that actually research in this instance actually means, making money means research, right? Like in many instances, people just want to sign or turn over more customers, for example. Research is something that's incredibly long-term orientated, particularly with things that are not well known. It's often very speculative, and because we're talking about, in many instances, still relative to other forms of research, an incredibly small market base, because it is more long-term and risky, investors are always not likely to engage with it. So I think the benefit is pretty exclusive. I'll unpack that later throughout the speech when it integrates, but let's now talk about closing government's extensions. They have two, I think. I was kind of passed out for a sec. But the first one is just that family care is better. I'm just going to kind of step through this argument and explain why in each step it fails. It fails at the first step because there's obviously a set of families and people who, even if they are not bad people or they are not compassionate, don't feel comfortable engaging with this. It's because people have been socialized and prejudiced to feel like it's scary, for example, or they don't want to be around people who are epileptics because they get scared that they might hurt them, for example, or it's people who live too far away, or they, for example, are already so economically desperate that they can't take any additional time to take care of their family, which just suggests that if you believe that's true for some people, then obviously maybe they get some better emotional support and care, but they also terribly socially isolate other people. And I know that they say, well, you can still use that money to hire carers, but obviously, first of all, that removes the extent to which you're going to get emotional support, but it's also incredibly precarious because we explain not many people want to work in this industry, but also because they can't be there the whole time, often because if there's not other people there, there's no accountability to ensure they do their job well, and it means that even in the instances when they're not there, like overnight, for example, they are isolated, they have to deal with the problems themselves. They would just much rather be in government-run facilities that have people that are there, even if they're not good, that make them feel safe and secure. And I think you can weigh that form of security off the form of emotional support that closing government describes. But I also think the benefit that we get for these people is more certain, and it's unclear that they make so much more people emotionally supported for the trade-off that obviously some people will be cripplingly isolated, people who often cannot help themselves or manage themselves. So I think they actually have demonstrated why this is a net harm for their side. The second thing that they say is that they align the incentives of corporations with disabled individuals to give them better representation. This argument is not at all impacted. It is very difficult to weigh. For the obvious reason that you should ask yourself, what exactly are corporations doing to help these people? Like, is it like building more ramps at the park? Like, no, obviously their interests are only aligned to things like reducing the amount of regulation and oversight and their ability to operate, so they can do better things with these people. It's incredibly unclear that corporations actually cared about them or going to represent them meaningfully or substantially. Let's now talk about opening government. I think opening government and the opening half more broadly in this engage in a bit of a silly clash, because what opening government do is just say, here's a bunch of reasons why if they come in, they're going to be good. Let's just question that first premise on whether or not they're going to come in. I think the easiest way to see this is quite silly, is you just ask yourself, how large is would businesses choose to do this instead of doing something else? And obviously, first of all, they're incredibly productive investments that are more secure, that have larger market bases, where the business model is already established and it's better well known about, where there's like more focus on these sorts of things. But it's also that this market is particularly poor, which I know is not a mechanism that opening opposition uses, and opening government can see this when they say that these individuals can't in many instances work, that their income is very precarious, for example, and even if you believe you give them some amount of stipend, it's unclear whether that's enough to overcome all the upfront capital costs that, to their credit, opening opposition describe. But finally, opening government can see they're going to do things like antitrust legislation. Why would a person engaging in investment ever choose to enter into this market compared to another one? And that gets over the way the opening opposition try to deal with this, because they explain that in some ways it might not be good or it might not work out in the fullest instance. We just explain that people would never enter into this market in the first instance, because it's not a decision between investing and not investing, it's this investment versus a different investment. And that's what the opening half don't realise, which is that there would be so little capital for these sorts of things, which obviously requires them to do way more government subsidisation, I'll take in a second, and obviously requires them a huge amount of more, for example, logistical difficulties that they never fully engage with. Closing government.
Our side explains that we give people the dignity of choosing to rely entirely on a loved one, or all the way through the spectrum of assistance up to a facility, including moving to the city with this money. Why would you just mandate that they use the most extreme option or nothing?
Oh, I think the problem is that first of all, you don't actually explain that this would be enough money for people to actually make that choice meaningfully. Like completely moving and relocating your house as someone who might not be particularly economically employed consistently isn't something that I think you prove. But second of all, I don't think it's good, even if this choice is possible for the majority of people, to force a subset of the most vulnerable people to not have a choice in the ways I described when addressing your extension. So, why is our extension the most important thing in the round? It's very simple. It's because this data collection is fundamental to things like public policy that affects what types of research and disabilities are known about in the first instance, which doesn't just mean that these people get care, but they get social recognition. People are more willing to not write them off for example, just being idiots or being weirdos, which means that not only are these people better cared for in a physical sense, but in an emotional sense, in their ability to not just have a livable life, but one that is productive, one in which the quality is enduring, and one in which they can help. And no one at any point in the debate responds to the 5 reasons that Sam gives you as to why this wouldn't happen counterfactually. For that reason, this is a clear long-term benefit that affects every aspect of these people's lives. Quote CO.